Hi, Denise Gwen, reading aloud for you from my novel, His Christmas Eve Proposal, Book 3 in the Medicine Women of Alaska, Chapter 13. As she followed the man into the lumber mill, and with Drew bringing up the rear, she clutched her medical bag close to her chest. Paul burst in behind them. I'm going to check on the patient with the broken leg, but I'll get the operating room ready for you two, so why don't you go scrub up? That's fine, Paul, Drew said, but we can take care of sterilizing the room. No, you can't. You need to focus on the surgery. He glanced to a man who stood nearby. Let me take a quick look at the man with the broken leg, but I need to get their room prepped, and then I can set his leg. That's fine, Dr. Rutherford, the man said. Drew called out to his brother. Paul, you're going to need some help with your patient? I'll be fine, Paul called back. I'll get this guy stabilized and then send him out on the medevac. Okay, great. Drew glanced down at Naomi as they walked into the room with the patient. Dr. Schuster, he said, you're in charge. Okay, she said nervously. I'd better get scrubbed up then. She walked into the makeshift washroom and gave herself a pep talk. I'm operating on this man and I'm going to do the best job possible. Her surgical skills were coming straight to the forefront. Her patient's life depended on it. As she hurried to the sink, she shed her coat and inner jacket and rolled up her shirt sleeves. She stood at the sink, and as she did so, out of the corner of her eye, she saw Drew stripping down, and she couldn't help it. She glanced over at him surreptitiously and caught a good look. She gazed at his sculpted physique, marveling at the way his muscles moved, and he glanced up and caught her gaze. She blushed and looked away, and when she forced herself to look back at him, he was still staring at her, his eyes boring into her, seeing her, knowing her. He reached down into his medical bag and tossed her a pair of scrubs. Put these on, he said. You're not walking in there with your street clothes getting all dirty. She changed out of her street clothes and slipped on the scrubs and stood at the sink to scrub up. Is there a reason why Paul doesn't want to do the appendectomy? She asked. He prefers to perform work that's non-surgical. Wasn't he a surgeon in the army? Yes, but he was more of a medic. He doesn't like this kind of work. He prefers to tend to broken bones, stitching up scrapes, those kinds of injuries. It's a great thing you keep scrubs in your med bag. My dad always said to be ready for emergencies. And here I thought your dad wasn't a surgeon, she teased with a smile. Are you ready to go in? I am, she said. With her arms and hands held aloft in front of her, she stepped away from the sink. She glanced over at Drew, and he smiled at her from above his face mask. As they entered the makeshift operating theater, she saw Paul tending to the patient. He'd just given the patient enough morphine to ready him for what was to come. Have you done any appendectomies before? Paul asked. A few, she lied. With her arms and hands held aloft in front of her, she stepped away from the sink. She glanced over at Drew, and he smiled at her from above his face mask. As they entered the makeshift operating theater, she saw Paul tending to the patient. He'd just given the patient enough morphine to ready him for what was to come. Have you done any appendectomies before? Paul asked. A few, she lied. Good. I've got your patient stabilized, and I'm going to leave you two alone to handle this. The man with the broken legs got his leg in a cast, and I found out there are some other loggers further up the mountain with injuries. If you can wait, Paul, I'll come with you, Drew offered. Nah, Paul said, I'm good. Naomi noticed the two brothers gazing intently at one another, not speaking. They had a secret and deep understanding, these two. Thank you for prepping the patient, Dr. Rutherford, she said to Paul. Anytime, Dr. Schuster. Thanks, bro. Does the patient have antibiotics? She asked. Doing that, Drew said. She turned around and faced him and the patient. Drew stood over the IV drip that his brother had started. It was just the two of them now. No Paul to ease the growing tension between them. She went to the surgical instruments that Drew had laid out on a clean cloth. I wish I had a scrub nurse, she said mournfully. You're going to do fine. Thanks. He's out, Drew said. Remember, you've got this. Naomi stepped forward and reached down with gloved hands to touch the patient's abdomen. Manage his airway for me, okay? She said nervously. You've got it. She knew she could save this man. She knew how. She had the skill, she had the desire, and she had the drive. She pushed the scalpel against the soft skin, pressed down hard, and began the surgery. As she worked on the patient, she was relieved to see that the appendix had not burst, but it was bulging and it might burst open at any moment. She needed to work fast. As she operated, her heart floated. This was what she'd been trained to do. This was her specialty. This was her calling. She was a surgeon. Still, she was nervous. She'd performed many, many appendectomies, but never under these kinds of conditions, and that elevated her tension. She'd once been a heart surgeon, too, but this, yes, this she could manage. Her hands remained coolly steady as she performed the operation, and Drew thrust the right instrument into her hand at the same moment she wanted it, and she marveled at his prescience as if he were reading her mind. She removed the bulging appendix, laid it down onto the tray cloth, and sighed with relief as the bulging tissue throbbed, then slowly seeped open. Got it just in time, Drew said in a voice of admiration. Yes, she said. Suturing needle? By the time she was inverting the stump into the cecum, she was humming under her breath, just like old times. She stitched up the wound. That was terrific work, Drew said. Thank you, Dr. Rutherford, she said, and broke out into a wide grin. I trust a medevac is on the way to take the patient to a hospital for post-op care and for another round of antibiotics? The medevac's on its way, Drew said, and even as these words left his mouth, she heard the distant thump, thump, thump of a helicopter landing on the roof. Hey, can you take over the ventilation while I get the paramedics? Of course. She removed her gloves, tossed them onto the cloth holding the waist, and put on a fresh pair. She'd finished stitching up the patient's body and cleaned the wound, applying the pressure dressing, so she tended to the ventilation. All his vitals looked good. Drew burst back into the room a few minutes later, followed by two paramedics bearing a gurney between them. Here we are, he said. The patient's all nicely stitched up and ready to be transported to the hospital. And then he smiled at her, a deep, warm, loving smile, and he said, I knew you could do it. Naomi smiled through her sudden tears, then looked away. He had such tremendous faith in her, it amazed her to her core. How was it possible for him to have so much faith in her abilities when she herself had lost all faith? The paramedics moved the patient out of the room, and again, just like that, she and Drew were left all alone, standing inches apart. Thank you for your faith in me, she said with reserve as she turned away to clean up the mess. What amazes me so much, he said, is how little faith you have in yourself. I need to sterilize these instruments. Naomi, there's no way to do that up here. I'll get a clean cloth and wrap them up and toss them in my bag. We'll do it when we get back to the office. Naomi, did you hear what I said? Drew said her name so simply, so lovingly, it took her breath away. She looked up at him and saw the love and affection and faith in his eyes. Fighting back tears, she spoke. I was a surgeon back in Los Angeles. I wasn't just an intern. I was a surgeon. He grinned. Guessed that already. I'm not a surgeon anymore, Drew. Why aren't you? He gazed at her. During a routine surgery that should have gone well, I lost my nerve. I committed a huge error and the patient died. I'm no longer a surgeon. I wanted to get away from the hurly-burly lifestyle and decided to move to a quiet area. He snorted. This used to be a quiet area. That is, until developers came to town and started building that high-end resort. That's unfortunate, she said. It is, Drew said, because I hate change. Change is a necessary part of life. I know, but here's the thing. What with the resort and all the development coming this way, we may be getting a hospital. He smiled at her. A hospital would be a good thing for you could work as a surgeon. Why are you afraid of change? She asked him, point blank. Drew gazed at her for a long moment, then turned away. Naomi watched him walk out the door, helpless to stop him. What could she say to him about how positive a thing it was to accept change when she too was afraid of change? She'd fled from her career and hoped to make a big change up here, but the life and the work of a surgeon kept calling out to her. For the brief period of time that she'd been operating, she'd felt like herself again, and she hadn't felt like herself in a long time. She regretted, really regretted ever having left surgery, the hospital, and her old life behind.